On the 1st of November 1947, a notorious Second World War collaborator was led to a firing range for his execution. He was secured to the firing post, and then opposite him his firing squad stood, readied with their rifles. He took his last gasp of breath and showed absolutely no emotion as the firing squad were then given the order to fire. During the Second World War, there were many different men and women who collaborated with the Nazis and the German authorities inside of their occupied nations. Some did this to try and save themselves, but others collaborated as they held Nazi sympathies and they wanted to please the occupying forces. But after the end of the conflict, many governments sought to punish those men and women who did collaborate. Following the liberation of France, many women were forced to undergo the ugly carnival, where they had their heads shaved and they were covered in Nazi insignia. But many more nations ruthlessly executed the collaborators to punish them for their crimes, and one man who suffered this fate was Henry Rinnan, a Norwegian man who served as a brutal Gestapo agent, and his actions resulted in the deaths of many during the war. Join us today as we look at the execution of the Norwegian Gestapo chief and torturer, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Henry Oliver Rinnan was born on the 14th of May 1915 inside of Levanger in Norway, and he was born into a rather poor family. He was the eldest of 8 children, but he did not have the greatest childhood. Rinnan had very few friends, and he spent a lot of his time on his own, but he was known to others later in life because of his size. For a Norwegian man, he was remarkably short, standing at 5 feet 3 inches tall, but following working with his uncle in his business, Rinnan lost his job because he was caught stealing. He was a man who was more than comfortable with stealing from his own family members, and he would have very little remorse for his actions throughout his life. He was a vain but charming man, but following losing his job, he and his wife Clara were then living in a poorhouse. They were not allowed to keep any of their furniture except their bed. He was then employed as a car salesman in Trondheim, and his wife Clara then had their first child. However, Henry Rinnan around this time went on a short trip with another woman and returned home after 2 weeks, and he was also sacked from his job. However, in 1939, he tried to enlist in the Winter War in Finland. However, Rinnan had dentures in his upper mouth, and he was rejected because of this. But following the German invasion that occurred on the 9th of April 1940, he worked as a driver for Norwegian soldiers in Snåsa, but following the German occupation, he then served his enemies. In particular, he enlisted to become a German agent and was recruited to become a member of the Gestapo in June 1940. His parents had been members of pro-German groups, but it is not known if Henry Rinnan also joined these. However, inside of the Gestapo, he was tasked with infiltrating left-wing resistance groups in Trondheim and was working under the codename Fiskvik. Because of his work, around 50 to 60 people found themselves arrested for being communists. But in January 1942, he then recruited another 3 agents to work with him, and because of his work, he was given the rank of an SS Untersturmführer, and his group of spies then became known as the Rinnan Banden. They continued to infiltrate resistance groups, and they also tortured hundreds of people, and it's believed that over 80 people were killed by Rinnan and his men, and it's claimed that he kept strict discipline and also acted as a judge and executioner in many cases for resistors himself. He has also been described by some as a cynical rat and a scoundrel, and one former worker with him claimed that he did not realise what a monster we had created. He claimed Rinnan had a kind of sixth sense. It was almost as if he could smell danger. The special thing about Rinnan was that he was able to carry out his evil in a system that was created for it. His agents would track people down and then engage them in conversations about their attitudes towards the occupation, and then his agents built trust to infiltrate their networks. But it is claimed that the spies were responsible for at least 100 deaths in the Norwegian resistance and for more than 1,000 arrests. There were plans drawn up to assassinate Rinnan, and British Special Operations Executive had learned about his actions. One man, Sven B. Svensson, had been tasked to kill Rinnan, but he had a lack of weapons to do this at the time. Further plans were drawn up to take him out, and there were a number of attempts to kill him. One on the 7th of October 1943 did not go as planned, and he managed to escape unharmed, but another member of his torture group was shot and injured. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, Henry Rinnan tried to make an escape with hostages and some other spies. However, he was taken close to the Swedish border. They hiked towards Sweden in the rough terrain and the snow, and Rinnan did have a new fiancée who was pregnant and struggled. His men wore German soldier uniforms to try and blend in, and on his possession, Rinnan had a huge amount of banknotes and also a gun. His hostages were to be shot, and one managed to escape during a blizzard. However, on the 15th of May 1945, he was found by Norwegian police and was arrested. But he did manage to escape from prison on the 24th of December 1945, and he was going to try and get to the Soviet Union to then work as a Soviet secret agent, but within a few hours he was caught again. He was a man who was hated inside of Norway. When he was brought into the centre of the city, a number of people had gathered, and he refused to get out of the car, and as he was dragged out, many people cheered his arrest. But Rinnan, whilst he was in prison, was beaten badly by the guards, and also by other inmates, and when he was interrogated for the first time, he had very bad bruises on his face, and his eyes were heavily swollen. To get him to confess to information, he was also subjected to mock executions, where he believed he would either be shot or executed. He was heavily investigated for treason, and dozens of deaths were attributed to Henry Rinnan and his group, and they were also linked to sending around 1,000 Norwegians to concentration camps, where many died as soon as they got there. It was said that Rinnan cooperated closely with the Gestapo, and he allowed a number of war criminals to gain their freedom. But in what was known as the Norwegian treason settlement, Henry Rinnan, along with 11 others from the Rinnan gang, were sentenced to death. 10 of these would be executed. Specifically, Henry Rinnan was convicted of 13 murders and many more crimes. He was held inside of a prison for a number of years until his execution was finally carried out on the 1st of February 1947. He was to be executed very early in the morning at 4:05 a.m. inside of Christiansand Fortress in Trondheim. During his final days, a priest had been with him to provide him with spiritual guidance as his execution date approached. He was led out to the execution firing range, and a doctor attached a white cardboard disc to Rinnan's chest, and the prison priest repeated the words of Jesus to the robber on the cross to him, saying, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me to paradise." The execution squad was led by Lieutenant Sawley, who oversaw the execution. He gave his orders for the firing squad to ready, and they raised their rifles. Rinnan stood emotionless and still, and he had been blindfolded also by a guard when he was tied and secured to the execution post. The order was then given to fire, and immediately the firing squad shot their weapons into him. However, this was not the end of the execution. The leader of the execution squad then approached Rinnan's body, and he pulled out his Mauser pistol, then fired 2 coup de grace gunshots into Rinnan's head at close range into his temple, ensuring that his death had occurred. Straight after the execution, his body was cremated, but there was a slight issue, as his body should not allegedly have been placed in a coffin when he was cremated. His ashes were then buried in an unmarked plot near to his hometown. It was claimed that Henry Rinnan was the most useful non-German that Heinrich Himmler had under his wing inside of Northern Europe, and he claimed he had handed over 5,000 people to the Gestapo to be dealt with. There was some debate following his execution as to what actually happened with it, as some claimed he was actually spotted boarding a plane hours after the execution allegedly took place. But the documentation for the execution clearly shows what happened to the Gestapo spy and informant, and he was ruthlessly shot by a firing squad. Then the leader of the executioners finished him off. Henry Rinnan was a man who was a torturer, a brute, and a barbaric spy and executioner himself, who horrifically betrayed Norway, his nation, in favour of the Nazis. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.